How does one spot a tyrant? Well, this is not easy. History, at least as it is presented to us, appears to make it easy. In retrospect, tyrants are easy to identify, since they have already committed their crimes. And it must be said, defeated tyrants are even easier to spot, as we know that history is written by the winners. Once defeated, the stones can be overturned, the crimes revealed, and piled up bodies can be counted. And the winners can burnish their reputations by promoting the idea, either real or imagined, that they had some part to play in defeating said tyrant. Something had to be done, they say, and we did it. We were, as the phrase goes, on the right side of history. Adolf Hitler is, of course, the poster boy, the go-to example of this. And despite many people, comrades and friends included, encouraging me to upend the consensus, I'm still not comfortable with any kind of revisionism on this. As with external enemies, the foreign despot is still in place can be useful to an existing regime. The leaders of the Soviet Union were more than useful to the West during the Cold War. They were essential. And although we were unaware of it at the time, their existence was also essential to the moral health of the West. Whilst the Iron Curtain was still in place, the West could quite easily demonstrate how much better it was than the communist East. In a divided Germany, that difference was stark and obvious. West Germany was rich and successful, and it was also able to care for its citizens at least as well as socialist East Germany, whose only positive was an extensive welfare state that East Germans had to pay for in shoddy goods, break queues, and the paranoia of the Stasi. And the thing about foreign tyrants is that they are a useful source of fear for domestic politicians. Dissatisfied with your government? Well, look over there and see how bad it could be and thank your lucky stars. So don't bother with yourself with how we're ripping you off. Vladimir Putin and the war in Ukraine is a textbook example of this. But things get trickier when a tyrant dies without there ever having been a reckoning. When Stalin died, there was a thawing in the regime, both international and domestic, as the regime breathed a sigh of relief that the paranoid leader was no more. But as I understand it, it wasn't a complete break, the Soviet Union having survived for another 40 or so years, but merely a distancing of the regime from the crimes of its predecessor. It probably has alarming similarities with our society's activities during the COVID spasm. With enough water under the bridge, nobody wants to talk about it anymore. And this is a real issue, a society's dirty little secret that everybody knows about, but nobody will discuss, like the banishment of an unwed mother to a mental institution by a well-to-do family desperate to maintain its good name. But these truths cannot be buried forever. Eventually they will come to the surface, perhaps exposed by an outsider or by younger family members horrified by their discovery. But it is just as likely to come to the surface by the breaking of ranks by one or more of the conspirators who cannot live with what they have done. And this is one of the great benefits of never having fallen hook, line and sinker for the COVID con. I am not immaculate in this regard, having, and I still cringe about it now, having clapped for the NHS. In my defence, I was self-conscious about it at the time, thinking, am I being a moron? But then I thought, get over yourself. The medics were doing a good thing, whatever else I might think, and their efforts should be applauded. So like a performing seal, I stupidly banged my pots. Only once though, and I never complied with another thing. And what this means is that I never have to avoid or gloss over anything I ever did. I never pushed the jab, I never wore a mask, I never called for the banishment of others from society, I never wished harm or punishment upon others who took a different path, and I absolutely never grassed up or snitched on my neighbours, friends or my fellow compatriots. In some ways, this is merely a Pyrrhic victory, since as very few others want to talk about COVID anymore. I have precious little opportunity to signal my virtue. But I'm fine with that. My conscience is clear. And to those of you who did the same, I salute you because, like so many others, you didn't contribute to the tyranny. So back to the tyrants. The defeated ones are the easiest to spot. Those external ones still in power are usefully identified as tyrants by would-be tyrannical regimes at home. The tyrants that have died or faded away will be quietly forgotten. But what of those that are still in place in one's own countries? Keir Starmer certainly looks to our eyes like a tyrant, and he has very definitely upped the ante regarding the show trials and the disproportionate sentencing of immoderate spur-of-the-moment posts on Facebook. But is he really any different than Sunak or Johnson or May or Cameron or Brown or Blair? I think he is different, and that he has gone way beyond what is the norm. But even the norms are not what they were. They move incrementally over time, and slowly enough that we are not supposed to notice. David Icke's totalitarian tiptoe. But it's probably true to say that it's the regime that is tyrannical. The figurehead at the top is of little consequence. Starmer is charging full speed ahead down the totalitarian path and is making himself so unpopular with his brazen corruption that he may not survive in post for very much longer. But if he goes, who will be next? Despite the visceral horror and unbearable shame of the idea of David Lammy or Angela Rayner being Prime Minister, I'm not sure that it in practice makes much difference. All those at the top of Parliament are WEF-sponsored globalist net zero communists. Complaining vociferously about the current crop of the Labour front bench will only ensure that we get the Tories next time. But staying with two-tier Keir, or free gear Keir for the moment, I'm reminded of a post I saw where one of his defenders was railing against Starmer's critics, who were saying that he was a dictator. I can't recall whether any of them had likened him to Hitler, but for the sake of this argument, let's say that they did. This defender of Starmer was saying how ridiculous it was to compare him to Hitler, and on most metrics he was right. It is ridiculous. But Starmer has been in post for less than 3 months, and he has already jailed hundreds of people, a small number of which probably did deserve it, but many, possibly most, absolutely did not. Not being a historian, I've no way to compare, without extensive research, whether Adolf Hitler's record was better or worse. But did people recognise Hitler for what he was less than 3 months into the job? As I understand it, from my admittedly cursory knowledge of the subject, for some years he was viewed as a steadying hand and a necessary, and not to say admirable, remedy for Germany's ills. He was even Time magazine's Man of the Year in 1936, for heaven's sake. My point is, can people be relied upon to spot a tyrant when they see one? Although Starmer appears to be way out of his depth, due to the way he reached for the totalitarian cost so readily, and more to the point, so early, he's not a complete idiot. During the election campaign, all he had to do was effectively say nothing and allow the Tories to self-immolate. All elections are lost by the incumbent, but never was this more true than the 2024 election. A monkey with a red rosette would have beaten the Tories. So he was unidiotic enough to say anything controversial that might have turned it into a real contest over policy, principles, or even personalities. As pathetic as Goldman Sachs banker Sunak's man of the people shtick was, it was still better than Starmer's, which really is saying something. But how do we know he's not going to turn into a Hitler, a Stalin, or a Mao? The truth is, we don't know. All we can do is make the best guess we can, The Labour Party, like all socialists everywhere, do promote this idea that only they know how to fix the human condition, and with that attitude at the front of their minds, they feel justified in using authoritarian methods to achieve their aims. In extreme cases of capitalism going rogue, like during the banking crisis of 2008, this is not always the wrong position to take. Although it must be said that Labour was also in power then and treated the banks as though they were valued state assets rather than the voracious, out of control predators that they were, and bailed them out as if they were British Leyland in 1975. But we must not make the mistake of believing that the Tories would have done anything differently. When banks are profitable, they privatise those profits. But when push comes to shove, the losses are socialised. The taxpayer is given the bill. Another way in which it is difficult to identify a tyrant is because there are still at this stage many who support the regime. Some of these people are true believers, but most are mere opportunists. Opportunists who are currently delighting in being on the winning side and are relishing the chance to persecute their political enemies. And many of these opportunists will be feeling somewhat uncomfortable with what their side is doing, but for the moment will keep quiet. Most have kept stum over the show trials, not because they agree with the government jailing people for words, but because they, like the regime, despise the white working class. Interestingly, most of the criticism of Starmer and his team from the left has been because of the brazen, obvious, and undeniable corruption that has been revealed. Behaving like corrupt Tories seems to them to be more serious than removing one of the founding principles of a free society, like freedom of speech. But the ones who remain silent about calling out their own side when their own side is in power are complicit. And they know it. And the more complicit they are, the harder it gets to criticise them, and the more they become part of the regime, and the more difficult it is to remain a person of principle, and all the easier it is to identify with their side, no matter what their side does. But how to evaluate our current tyrant of the moment? How can we know whether Starmer's initial burst of authoritarianism is merely a one-off spasm, perhaps as a result of panic, or driven by a revulsion of the white working class, or a pure hatred of the gammon? It is instead a sign of things to come. And this is something that we could well do with knowing, if we want to know how to proceed. If it's the former, we need to keep our heads and keep our powder dry. But if it's the latter, well, what then? In that case, is there any reason not to rebel? Any reason other than cowardice, I mean. This issue has been addressed by some of the great men of the past. Churchill said of those in the British government in the 30s that appeased crocodiles in the hope that they would eat them last. Somewhat closer to the knuckle was Solzhenitsyn's famous treatise, and I quote, "And how we burned in the camps later, thinking, what would things have been like if every security operative, when he went out at night to make an arrest, had been uncertain whether he would return alive and had to say goodbye to his family? Or if, during periods of mass arrest, as for example in Leningrad, when they arrested a quarter of the entire city, people had not simply sat there in their lairs, paling with terror at every bang of the downstairs door and at every step on the staircase, but had understood that they had nothing left to lose, and had boldly set up in the downstairs hall an ambush of half a dozen people with axes, hammers, pokers, or whatever else was to hand. After all, you knew ahead of time that those blue caps were out at night for no good purpose, and you could be sure ahead of time that you'd be cracking the skull of a cutthroat. What about the Black Maria sitting out there on the street with one lonely chauffeur? What if it had been driven off or its tyres spiked? The organs of Soviet state institutions would very quickly have suffered a shortage of officers and transport, and notwithstanding all of Stalin's thirst, the cursed machine would have ground to a halt. If we didn't love freedom enough, and even more, we had no awareness of the real situation. We spent ourselves in one unrestrained outburst in 1917, and then we hurried to submit. We submitted with pleasure. We purely and simply deserved everything that happened afterwards. Close quote. Closer still were the countless faceless millions who willingly loaded themselves onto the Nazi boxcars to Auschwitz, Belsen and Dachau, believing it to be for the best. When did they finally believe that they were beyond rescue? When they arrived at their destination and were immediately separated from their families and stripped of their luggage, their spectacles, and then all of their clothes. Did they realise it then? And did those enraged protesters in Southport or Rotherham, or even the Twitter and Facebook posters, with their careless but entirely understandable internet comments, realise it? I imagine that sentenced prisoners are stripped of their clothes once processed into their respective prisons and given their prison uniforms. Is that when those family men or those caring for elderly spouses realise that the state, their state, the one they pay for, was quite willing to destroy their lives for daring to disagree? And when exactly did the parents of the 11-year-old boy arrested over the disorder realise that the state actually hates them and will persecute a child to enforce its opinions? It's at this point that it is worth reminding people that there are only 130,000 police officers in the whole country. That's one law enforcer for every 532 people. And that is, of course, assuming that the 100,000 plus illegal boat migrants that have been put up in hotels all across the country are here merely to milk the welfare system and are not here for law enforcement purposes. But even if that particular conspiracy theory is true, there's still 300 of us to every one of them. And even if only 15% of us stood up, which is admittedly all that probably would stand up initially, that's still 46 to 1. The power of the state is illusory. Once 300 million Indians understood that illusion, namely that 100,000 British soldiers and administrators were powerless to control them, Indian independence followed in pretty short order. The Indians realised it, and the British realised it, and when they did, then the jig really was up. But it requires courage to be the first. However, having said that, it is pure folly to deliberately put oneself in the firing line. You can't help anyone, least of all yourself and your family, from a prison cell. We must dodge and evade the law, not by doing illegal things, but by not giving the authorities any ammunition to pursue us, since we have seen that they can twist and contort the law to invent any number of trumped up charges. Almost anything can be manipulated into hate speech, so be careful with your words. Believe what you believe, but since freedom of speech is something that we used to have, we can no longer say what we think. That was yesterday's Britain, not today's. Another marker, another giveaway of a totalitarian regime will be the emergence, or indeed the prevalence, of charges like treason, subversion, or sedition. We already have hate speech and misinformation. Once we start hearing those words, it will be further proof, if further proof is needed, that we are already a very long way down the totalitarian path. When will it be time to fight back? Or are we destined to burn in the camps? Will we purely and simply deserve everything that happens to us? With that in mind, I again reiterate my appeal for 1,000 men, 1,000 men in each district. There is a movement in the United States to rescue the Republic. I propose a movement to rescue the kingdom. Or with a nod to Tommy, to unite the kingdoms. Stay free.